welcome back to Drowsy History. Or, if this is your first time here, welcome. I am so glad you found this little corner of the internet, wherever in the world you are right now. Before we begin tonight, I want to ask two small things of you. First, if you haven't already, hit subscribe. It takes 1 second and it means the next long, slow story will find its way to you without you having to go looking. And second, drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. I genuinely read every single one of them. There is something that moves me every time, knowing that someone in Osaka is listening at midnight, and someone in Edinburgh is listening at 4 in the morning, and someone in a suburb of Sao Paulo has this playing softly while the city goes quiet outside their window. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Now, let your shoulders drop. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let the sound of the day, whatever it was, begin to settle. There is nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to remember. No list that needs your attention until morning. Tonight, we are going a long way away in both time and place. We are going to Japan. Not the Japan of bullet trains and neon cities and cherry blossom festivals, though all of that is beautiful and real. We are going to an older Japan, a quieter Japan in some ways, and a more violent one in others, a Japan of pine forests and rice paddies and castle towns perched above river valleys in the early morning mist. We are going to feudal Japan, to the world of the samurai. The word samurai carries a lot of weight in the Western imagination, and most of that weight is cinematic. The lone warrior on horseback, the swift drawing of the sword, the code of honor that demands death before dishonor. Some of that is real or rooted in something real. Most of it is simplified, romanticized, and stripped of the texture and ordinariness that made up the actual daily life of the people who carried those swords. So tonight, we are going to slow down and look at the texture. We are going to sit inside the actual life of a samurai, what they ate and wore, how they trained and slept, what they worried about, how they prayed, how they died. We are going to find out what it was actually like to move through a feudal Japanese day in the skin of someone who had been born to one of the most demanding and contradictory roles in human history. There is no quiz at the end. You do not need to remember any of this. If your thoughts begin to wander somewhere around the training yard or the tea ceremony, that is exactly right. The story will carry you wherever you need to go. Close your eyes when you are ready. Let us begin. The word samurai comes from the Japanese verb saburao, which means simply to serve. It is a word that contains, right at its roots, the central tension of everything that followed. Here was a class of people defined by service to another, who would eventually become the most powerful force in Japanese society, who would rule from behind the throne for nearly 7 centuries, who would develop an entire philosophy of warrior virtue, and who would remain, through all of it, technically servants. The samurai class emerged gradually over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, as the imperial court at Kyoto found that governing a large and increasingly restive country required people who could actually fight. The court itself was composed of aristocrats and scholars and poets, people of enormous refinement who considered manual labor beneath them and warfare even further beneath that. When bandits needed suppressing or rival clans needed managing, The court turned to provincial warriors who had been developing fighting skills over generations, often on the frontiers of imperial expansion into the northern territories where the indigenous Ainu people had long resisted incorporation into the Japanese state. These provincial warriors, the Bushi, gradually consolidated into hereditary clans, developed their own traditions and loyalties, and found that their military skills gave them a power that the imperial court, for all its cultural prestige, increasingly needed and could not provide for itself. By the late 12th century, the warrior class had effectively taken over the administration of Japan, establishing the first shogunate, a military government that would, with various interruptions and transformations, remain the dominant political reality in Japan until 1868. At the height of the feudal period, which for our purposes covers roughly the 13th through the 19th centuries, the samurai were a legally defined hereditary class. You were born a samurai or you were not. Your father was a samurai, and his father before him, and your sons would be samurai after you. This is the world we are entering tonight, not the world of a man who chose the warrior path, but the world of a man or woman who was born into it, who grew up inside its expectations and its disciplines and its codes, who inhabited it as naturally as you inhabit your own life, because it was the only life they had ever known. That class was not a monolith. At the top were the great lords, the daimyo, who ruled their domains like small kingdoms, maintaining armies of hundreds or thousands of samurai vassals and living in fortified castles that dominated the landscape for miles in every direction. Below them were the senior retainers, the men of good family who held significant stipends and commanded others. Below them were the middle ranking samurai, the bulk of the class, who formed the backbone of any domain's fighting force and administrative apparatus. And at the bottom were the foot soldiers and minor retainers, men who carried swords by right of birth, but who might live more modestly than a prosperous merchant, eating plain food and wearing worn out clothes and wondering whether the stipend would arrive before the rice ran out. What united all of these people across the enormous range of their circumstances was the sword. The right to wear two swords in public, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, was the legal marker of samurai status. No other class had that right. Farmers and merchants and craftspeople might be wealthier than some samurai, might live in more comfort, might even hold more practical influence in their communities. But they did not wear swords. The swords were the sign, the seal, the visible declaration of a particular relationship with violence and with honor that defined the samurai above all other considerations. We will spend most of our time tonight in the middle of the social spectrum with the samurai who were neither great lords nor desperate foot soldiers, but the competent, trained, duty bound men of the middle ranks who made the system function. These are the people for whom the word samurai most fully resonates across history, and whose daily lives were most fully shaped by the codes and disciplines we associate with the term. The day began early. This is one of the consistent truths of pre-industrial life across cultures and centuries, and feudal Japan was no exception. By the time the sky showed its first gray light in the east, a samurai retainer would already be awake, his body accustomed to the rhythm through years of practice, his mind moving into wakefulness, the way a practiced swimmer enters water. Not with a shock, but with a smooth, habitual transition. The sleeping arrangements of a middle ranking samurai in a castle town during the Edo period, roughly the 17th through 19th centuries, were simple by modern standards and comfortable by the standards of most of human history. He would have slept on a futon laid directly on tatami mats, the thick woven rush floor covering that was standard in samurai households. The futon was a thick cotton quilt, heavy and warm, stuffed with cotton batting, rolled out on the tatami each night and rolled away again each morning to store in a wooden chest. There were no chairs in a traditional Japanese home, no tables of Western height, no beds raised from the floor. Life happened at floor level, which required a kind of physical ease and flexibility that most Westerners today, accustomed to chairs and couches, would struggle to maintain. The bedroom, if we can call it that, was not a permanently designated room in most samurai homes. It was whatever room the futon was laid in, separated from other spaces by sliding paper screens called shoji, which diffused the early morning light into a soft, even glow that fell across the tatami without shadows. Those screens could be moved to create larger or smaller spaces as needed. Japanese domestic architecture of the period was modular, flexible, and designed for a life that moved through different configurations of space at different times of day. It was also, in its way, beautiful. The clean lines of the wooden framework, the warmth of the tatami, the gentle light through the paper screens, the smell of cedar and rush, and the faint outdoor smell of whatever garden or courtyard lay just on the other side of the exterior wall. The first thing upon waking was water. A basin would have been set out the previous evening, or a servant would bring fresh water in the early morning, and the samurai would wash his face and hands with cold water, the cold being bracing and deliberate, part of the hardening that was expected to begin the day. Then came the arrangement of the hair, which for a male samurai of the period meant the careful oiling and dressing of the distinctive topknot, the shanmaj, which involved shaving the top of the head and gathering the remaining hair into a knot folded forward over the shaved crown. This was not a quick process. It required attention and sometimes assistance from a wife or servant. The appearance of the hair and the person was a matter of serious concern. A samurai presented to the world a certain image, and that image began with the body, clean and composed and arranged according to convention. Clothing came next. The standard daily dress of a samurai retainer in the castle town on a routine day of administrative duties or training rather than battle was the hakama, wide pleated trousers worn over a kimono, and a jacket called a haori if the day was formal or the weather cool. The colors were generally subdued, dark blues, grays, browns, sometimes a deep green or black. The clan crest, the mon, might appear on the kimono or the jacket, a small circular design in white or a contrasting color, indicating at a glance which lord the samurai served. Dressing was not casual. Each layer was arranged carefully. The kimono overlapped left over right. The reverse, right over left, was reserved for the dead. The obi sash wound and tied with practiced efficiency. Then the sword belt, the seijo, threading through the folds of the obi, and then the swords themselves, the long katana through the belt, edge upward, the shorter wakizashi beside it. The weight of the swords was constant and familiar, the way a wedding ring becomes familiar to someone who has worn it for decades. Present without requiring constant attention, but never entirely forgotten. Breakfast was simple. The foundation of the samurai diet, like the diet of all Japanese people of the period, was rice, steamed white rice, served in a lacquered bowl, accompanied by miso soup, made from fermented soybean paste, dissolved in dashi broth with tofu and seasonal vegetables, and perhaps a small dish of pickled vegetables, tsukemono, whose sharp fermented flavor cut cleanly against the blandness of the rice. This was the standard Japanese breakfast of the period, and has remained the standard Japanese breakfast in many homes to this day, one of those culinary traditions so well suited to its purpose that it has survived with very little change across centuries. It was not elaborate, it was not meant to be. It was fuel and nourishment and the quiet ritual of beginning the day, eaten at a low table, seated on a zabuton cushion on the tatami, with a composure that was itself a kind of practice. The training that defined a samurai's life did not begin in adulthood. It began in childhood, sometimes very early childhood, and it continued without significant interruption until old age or death made it impossible. A samurai boy would begin serious martial training between the ages of 5 and 7, depending on the family and the domain. Before that, there were physical exercises, games designed to build strength and coordination, and the ability to endure physical discomfort without complaint. The ability to sit still, formally in seiza, kneeling upright with the tops of the feet flat on the floor for extended periods without fidgeting or showing pain, was one of the first lessons. Seiza is an extraordinarily demanding position for a body not trained to it. The pressure on the knees and ankles, the stillness required in the upper body, the effort of maintaining an upright spine without the support of a chair back. Learning to sit this way for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, while a teacher spoke or a ceremony unfolded or a lord gave audience, was the kind of discipline that the samurai tradition required from its earliest stages. The sword was not the first weapon a boy learned. That distinction usually belonged to the jo, a wooden staff, and to unarmed grappling, what would later be systematized into judo and jujutsu. The body itself was the first weapon, its balance, its reflexes, its capacity to absorb impact and recover. A boy who understood his own body's movement, who could fall and rise cleanly, who could close distance with an opponent and use their weight against them, was a boy who could be taught the more specific skills of sword, spear, and bow with a foundation that made those skills coherent rather than mechanical. Swordsmanship was learned through kata, formalized sequences of movement practiced alone or with a partner. A kata was not a free exchange. It was a precisely choreographed interaction, every cut and parry and step determined in advance, practiced so many thousands of times that the movement ceased to be thought and became reflex. The logic was this: in actual combat, there is no time to think. The body must know what to do before the mind has processed the situation. Kata was the method of writing responses into the body's deep memory, below the level of conscious decision, so that when a blade was actually moving toward the face, the appropriate counter movement happened without the delay of thought. This required repetition on a scale that is difficult to convey. A single kata sequence might be practiced 100 times in a single training session. That same sequence might be practiced every day for years until it was as natural as breathing. Training sessions in the morning began with formal bowing to the dojo, the practice space, and to the teacher. The relationship between teacher and student in the martial arts was one of the most serious relationships in samurai culture. The teacher was not merely an instructor, but a model, a person whose entire character and way of life was meant to inform the student's development. Disrespect to a teacher, in even the smallest gesture, was considered a serious lapse, not because of social convention, but because the training required a degree of trust and surrender that demanded genuine respect as its foundation. You could not learn to be corrected if you were not genuinely willing to be wrong. The training sword, the bakken, was a wooden sword of the same length and weight as a real katana, which meant that a blow from it, delivered with full force, could easily break bones or cause serious injury. Training with the bakken was not gentle. The bruises and aches that accumulated over a morning's serious practice were worn without comment because showing pain was itself a form of weakness that the training was designed to eliminate. Not the absence of pain, which would have been both impossible and dangerous, but the absence of the performance of pain, the ability to register discomfort as information rather than as an event requiring expression. Archery, kyudo, was practiced separately and with an almost religious formality. The Japanese bao, the yumi, was a long asymmetric weapon, taller than the archer, made of laminated bamboo and wood, and shooting it correctly required a precision of posture and movement that took years to develop. The ritual of kyudo was as important as the mechanics. Approaching the target, knocking the arrow, drawing and releasing, all had to be done with a quality of presence and stillness that the practitioners described as a spiritual state as much as a physical one. The arrow was meant to go where it went because the archer had been completely unified with the act of shooting, not because of calculation or force of will. The target was, in a sense, almost incidental. Spear fighting, naginata for the long curved pole weapon, and yari for the straight spear, was also part of the curriculum, though the relative emphasis varied by school and by period. In the earlier centuries of the samurai, before the sword became the defining symbol of the class, the spear and the bow were often more important in actual battlefield conditions. A mounted samurai attacking at full gallop was more dangerous with a spear than a sword. It was only gradually, through the long centuries of relative peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, that the sword assumed its iconic cultural prominence over the other weapons. Swimming was part of the training, specifically swimming in armor, an essential skill for a warrior who might need to cross a river in full equipment. Swimming in armor is a specific and demanding skill, the weight and drag of metal and lacquer plates, transforming what is already a difficult physical act into something that requires a completely different approach to movement in the water. Climbing, running long distances, horsemanship, all of these were part of the physical education of a samurai retainer in the full tradition. By midday, after several hours of this training, a samurai would be bathed in sweat, the muscles burning in the specific way of genuine exertion, the body having moved through ranges of motion and levels of effort that registered clearly as demand. This physical tiredness, accumulated daily over years and decades, was not something to be avoided, but something to be sought. The body that had not been pushed that day had not been maintained. The samurai who did not train had allowed rust to form on the tool that his life depended on. No discussion of samurai life is honest without an honest accounting of bushido, the way of the warrior, the code that is simultaneously the most famous and most misunderstood aspect of samurai culture. Bushido was not, at most points in samurai history, a written code. It was not a list of rules. It was a set of values and attitudes that were transmitted through practice and example and story and the accumulated pressure of a tradition, absorbed over years of training and living inside the samurai world. The word bushido itself did not come into wide use until relatively late in the tradition, and its most famous formal articulation in the text Hagakure, dictated by the samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 18th century, is in many ways an elegy for a way of life the author felt was already disappearing. Like many articulations of traditional values, it was written in the moment of the tradition's passing. The core of what Bushido meant in practice centered on several interrelated values. Loyalty, Chu, was primary. A samurai's loyalty to his lord was not merely a professional obligation, but an existential one. It defined his purpose and his identity. The lord-retainer relationship was understood as total and unconditional, in theory if not always in practice, a bond that transcended personal interest or survival. The most extreme expression of this was the expectation, widespread in samurai culture, that a retainer should be willing to die for his lord without hesitation, and in certain circumstances, to die in the specific ritual form of seppuku if the lord demanded it, or if the circumstances of honor required it. Honor Meio was the second pillar, and it was inseparable from reputation. In a society with no social safety net, no police force in the modern sense, and no legal recourse available to the lower classes against the samurai, a samurai's reputation for trustworthiness and integrity was the foundation of his ability to function in his world. A samurai who broke his word, who ran from a fight, who behaved dishonorably in any of the recognized ways, was destroyed socially in a manner that was, within the values of the culture, equivalent to death. This made honor, in the feudal Japanese sense, not a luxury or an ideal, but a practical necessity of survival. Rectitude, sojii, was the sense of moral uprightness, of doing what was right because it was right, without regard to personal benefit or cost. Courage, yu, was valued not as mere physical bravery, but as the capacity to do the right thing even in the face of fear or difficulty, which required having first cultivated the clarity to know what the right thing was. Benevolence, jin, was the quality of compassion and care for others, particularly for those under one's protection. The samurai was not meant to be a brute, but a guardian, and the capacity for tenderness was considered compatible with and even necessary for the warrior role. Respect, rei, governed the elaborate system of formal courtesy that structured every social interaction, from the depth of a bow to the precise language used in addressing superiors, equals, and subordinates. And sincerity, makoto, the quality of truthfulness and authenticity in all dealings, was what held all the other virtues together and gave them substance. These values existed in constant tension with the realities of power, violence, and human weakness. Samurai betrayed their lords. Samurai lied. Samurai ran from battles and covered their running with stories. The code was an ideal, and ideals are precisely the things that humans most consistently fail to live up to while remaining genuinely shaped by them. The fact that bushido was not uniformly practiced does not make it culturally insignificant. It makes it culturally revealing. A society that articulates an ideal that clearly and enforces it that systematically is telling us something important about what it values and what it fears, about what kind of people it is trying to produce, and what kind of world it is trying to build. The most haunting element of bushido, and the one that most requires careful handling, is the relationship to death. The Hagakure opens with a line that has become its most famous: "The way of the samurai is found in death." This is not a celebration of violence or a nihilistic dismissal of life. It is, in the context of the full tradition, a more specific and more practical claim that a samurai who has genuinely accepted his own death, who does not cling to survival as the primary value, is freed from the hesitation and calculation that make a warrior unreliable. A man fighting to preserve his life will make different decisions than a man who has already, in some sense, consented to his death. The Zen influenced philosophy behind this idea held that the acceptance of death was a path to full presence in life, that only by releasing the grip on survival could one be truly alive in the moments one had. This philosophy, whatever one makes of it, required a daily practice. It was not enough to say one had accepted death. The acceptance had to be lived, reinforced, renewed each day. Some samurai maintained a meditation practice specifically centered on imagining the various ways they might die: in battle, by illness, by accident, by their own hand. The goal was not morbidity, but equanimity, to arrive at a relationship with mortality that was clear and calm rather than suppressed or denied. Here is something that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The samurai were expected to be artists, not hobbyists, not dilettantes. Artists is in a serious and disciplined sense. The concept that governed this expectation was bunbu ryodo, the dual path of literary and martial arts. A samurai who was only a warrior was considered incomplete, even somewhat crude. The ideal was a man of equal cultivation in both domains, capable of cutting down an opponent in the training yard in the morning and composing a poem of genuine feeling in the afternoon, capable of conducting a tea ceremony with the same focused attention he brought to a kata sequence, capable of reading classical Chinese literature and understanding the ethical and historical arguments it made. These were not decorative accomplishments. They were considered essential to the full development of the person, and by extension, to the full development of the warrior. Poetry was perhaps the most valued of the literary arts. The dominant form was waka, the classical Japanese poem in which a fixed syllable structure, most famously the 5-7-5-7-7 of the tanka, was used to compress an observation or emotion into a small, precise form. The haiku, the most famous Japanese poetic form in the West, with its 5-7-5 structure, developed later from this tradition. A samurai was expected to be able to compose poetry on demand, to respond to a poem offered by a superior or a lover with an appropriate reply composed on the spot, and to produce, at the significant moments of life, a poem that captured the moment with clarity and feeling. Death poems, jisei, were a specific tradition. A samurai facing death, whether in battle or by seppuku, was expected to compose a final poem that expressed his state of mind at the moment of departure from life. Some of these death poems are extraordinarily moving, some are perfunctory. All of them tell us something about a culture that expected its warriors to engage with language and feeling right up to the final breath. Calligraphy, shodo, was practiced daily by many samurai as a meditative discipline. The relationship between the brush, the ink, and the paper required a quality of attention and physical control that had parallels with swordsmanship, the same capacity for stillness, the same demand for precision, the same consequence of a momentary lapse of focus. A calligraphic brushstroke cannot be corrected. Like a sword cut, it either is or is not what it was meant to be, and the quality of the attention behind it shows in the result. Hanging scrolls of calligraphy, often inscribed with a poem or a Zen teaching, were the primary decorative element of samurai homes, hanging in the tokonoma, the recessed alcove that every formal Japanese room contained, where a scroll and perhaps a flower arrangement constituted the room's entire aesthetic statement. Tea ceremony, chado, the way of tea, was a practice that deserves extended attention because it was, in the Edo period, deeply intertwined with samurai culture. The practice is formalized by the tea master Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century, and the aesthetic principles he developed around it, wabi cha, the tea of rustic simplicity, were embraced by the warrior class with an enthusiasm that might seem paradoxical, but makes perfect sense once you understand the underlying philosophy. A tea ceremony in the wabi tradition involved a small room, sometimes as small as 2 tatami mats, built deliberately modest and rough in its materials, unfinished wooden posts, clay walls, a low entrance called a nijiriguchi, through which everyone had to crawl, lord and retainer alike, equalizing them by requiring each person to bow in through the same low door. Inside, the kettle of water heated over a charcoal fire. The host prepared the matcha, powdered green tea, with a bamboo whisk in a ceramic bowl, and offered it to the guest with a bow. The guest received it with a bow, turned it in the hands to appreciate its form, drank it, and returned it. The entire exchange was governed by a precise etiquette, but beneath the etiquette was an intention to be completely present with this bowl, this tea, this moment, this other person, in a way that ordinary life, with all its noise and distraction, did not permit. For the samurai, who lived inside a code that demanded the acceptance of death and the full presence of life, the tea ceremony was not an escape from their reality, but an intensification of it. The Japanese aesthetic of mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of transience, the poignant quality of things precisely because they do not last, was woven through both the warrior's relationship to death and the tea practitioner's relationship to the perfect moment that would never come again. The bowl in the hands, the steam from the tea, the sound of the water in the kettle, the light through the single paper window. These things were beautiful exactly because they were temporary, because in a moment they would be gone, because everything was always on its way to being gone. Music was also part of the samurai's world, particularly the shakuhachi, the end-blown bamboo flute whose breathy, resonant tone is one of the most distinctively Japanese sounds. Some samurai played the koto, a long zither with 13 strings, and some the shamisen, a 3-stringed lute. These were not merely entertainments, but disciplines, requiring the same kind of sustained practice and attention as the martial arts. The ability to play well was a mark of cultivation. Music in a samurai home was not background sound, but foreground experience, something to which full attention was given and received. Theater, particularly no drama, was deeply associated with samurai culture. No is perhaps the most austere of theatrical forms, performed at a glacial pace by masked actors in elaborate costumes on a bare stage, the language archaic and poetic, the subject matter drawn from classical literature, supernatural encounters, stories of warrior ghosts unable to rest. A no performance could last hours, each movement minimal and precisely meaningful, the audience expected to bring sufficient cultivation to understand what they were watching. The shogunate patronized no extensively, and attendance at no performances was part of the formal cultural life of the samurai class. After afternoon training, then, which might take a different form than the morning session, focused on horsemanship or archery or the management of administrative duties, the samurai who had the leisure for it might spend the later afternoon hours in one of these artistic pursuits, writing in his journal, practicing calligraphy, reading a classical text, or simply sitting in the garden with a particular quality of attention that was itself a kind of practice. The samurai home in the castle town of the Edo period was designed according to principles that were both practical and aesthetic, and understanding it helps us understand the life that took place inside it. The typical middle ranking samurai compound was surrounded by a plastered mud wall or a wooden fence with a formal gate at the entrance. The house itself was of wooden post and beam construction, raised slightly from the ground on stone footings to allow air circulation and prevent rot, with a tiled or thatched roof extending generously beyond the walls to shed the heavy rains of the Japanese summer. The interior was divided by the sliding screens, shoji and fusuma, into spaces that could be reconfigured: a formal reception room for receiving guests, a family living area, a kitchen at the back where the cooking fire burned, storerooms, and perhaps a small garden that could be viewed from the main rooms. The garden was not incidental. In the Japanese aesthetic tradition, the garden was an extension of the interior, a composed landscape that was meant to be viewed from specific points within the house, framed by a doorway or a window like a living painting. Rocks and moss and carefully shaped trees and a path of stepping stones. These were the elements of a dry garden, the karasen-sui, which could suggest rivers and mountains through arrangement and proportion without using actual water. A small water feature, a basin fed by a bamboo pipe, its sound audible from the nearest room, added another dimension. The garden was maintained with the same careful attention given to every other aspect of a samurai household, because the quality of attention one brought to the small things was the same quality one brought to the large ones. The kitchen, the daidokoro, was the domain primarily of the women of the household. Cooking in a feudal Japanese home involved a wood-burning hearth, the irori, a square pit in the floor over which a kettle or pot was suspended on an adjustable hook, and a separate raised stove, the kimono, built of clay in which the rice was steamed. Cooking rice correctly was an art in itself. The ratio of water to rice, the management of the heat from the clay stove, the timing of the transitions from high heat to low heat to resting, the final result of each grain cooked through and separate, fragrant and white, was the product of years of practice. The kitchen smelled of rice and dashi broth and miso and the smoke of the cooking fire, and those smells, for a samurai returning home from a long day of training and administrative duties, carried all the weight of familiarity and comfort that home smells always carry. The bath, the ofuro, was a daily ritual of considerable importance in Japanese culture. The Japanese approach to bathing is communal and sequential. The body is first washed and rinsed outside the bath, and only then clean does one enter the deep wooden tub of very hot water to soak. The purpose of the soaking is not washing, but immersion. The heat, the depth of the water, the steam, the transition from the activity of the day to the stillness of the water was understood as a physical and psychological transition, a deliberate setting down of the day. Samurai households maintained a wooden bath heated by a fire beneath it, and the daily bath was not a luxury, but a standard expectation. Women in samurai households occupied a complicated position that has been both romanticized and misunderstood in Western accounts. They were not imprisoned or powerless, but their power operated within strict parameters. The management of the household, the finances, the education of young children, the supervision of servants, all of these fell within the woman's domain and required real skill and authority. A samurai wife was expected to be educated, capable, and composed, able to manage a large household, to receive guests appropriately, to teach her children the basic disciplines of reading and writing and etiquette. In the warrior tradition, there was also a specific role for women in the defense of the home. The naginata, the curved pole weapon, was considered a woman's weapon, and samurai daughters were trained in its use. The image of a samurai woman defending her home with a naginata while her husband was away is not a fantasy, but a real tradition. The relationship between husband and wife in a samurai household was formal by modern standards. Public displays of affection were considered unseemly. The hierarchy of the household was clear. The husband was the head, and within the structure of the household, his authority was supreme. But within that structure, real warmth and partnership existed. Diaries and letters from the period show samurai men writing to their wives with genuine tenderness and concern, and women managing the complexities of the household with a competence and authority that belie any simple characterization of their role as merely subordinate. Children in a samurai household were the objects of serious attention from an early age. The education of a samurai child was not left to chance or to schools alone, but was considered a fundamental responsibility of the parents, particularly the father. A father who produced a son who could not fight, could not read, could not comport himself with appropriate gravity and discipline, had failed in one of his primary duties. This created a particular quality of attention toward children that was serious and high expectation, but not, in the historical record, cold or uncaring. Accounts of samurai fathers with young children show men who taught their sons the arts of the warrior with patient repetition, who tested their daughters on their calligraphy with genuine interest in the quality of the work, and who, in the private records of their lives, expressed real love for their children alongside the high demands they placed on them. The spiritual life of the samurai cannot be separated from the rest of their life, because for most samurai of the feudal period, what we would call religion was not a separate category, but the pervasive background of everything else. Two traditions dominated, Shinto and Buddhism, and most samurai practiced both simultaneously without experiencing any contradiction between them. This is one of the most striking differences between the Japanese spiritual tradition and the Abrahamic religions. In Japan, having more than one religious practice was not merely tolerated, but was the norm. The relationship was sometimes described as Buddhism for death and Shinto for life, which is an oversimplification but contains something true. Shinto, Japan's indigenous spiritual tradition, does not have a founding figure, a sacred text, or a systematic theology. It is instead a practice of attention to the sacred quality, kami, that resides in certain places and objects and natural phenomena, in mountains and rivers and ancient trees, and the forces of weather and the ancestors of the clan. The kami are not gods in the Western sense, though the translation is conventional. They are more like the concentrated spiritual power of a place or a lineage, something that demands acknowledgement and respect and careful ritual attention. A samurai household maintained a small Shinto altar, a kamidana, a god shelf mounted on a wall of the main room, on which offerings of rice and salt and water were placed daily and prayers were spoken. The ancestral spirits of the family, who remained present and interested in the welfare of their descendants, were honored here alongside the local kami. Buddhism, which had arrived in Japan from China and Korea in the 6th century, offered what Shinto did not: a systematic account of suffering and liberation, an ethical framework, and a set of meditative practices that address the existential questions of impermanence and death with philosophical sophistication. The Buddhist tradition that had the deepest influence on samurai culture was Zen, the school of meditation Buddhism that had been transmitted to Japan from China in the 12th and 13th centuries. Zen's emphasis on direct experience over doctrinal learning, its use of koan, paradoxical questions, and stories that could not be answered by the rational mind, its insistence on the complete reality of the present moment, and its tradition of disciplined sitting meditation, zazen, resonated deeply with a warrior culture that valued action over theory and presence over abstraction. Many samurai maintained a regular zazen practice, the practice of sitting in silence, attending to the breath, encountering the habitual movements of the mind without being driven by them, required the same basic qualities that swordsmanship required: stillness, attention, the capacity to be fully present without being distracted. The connection between Zen practice and martial practice was not metaphorical. Masters of swordsmanship described the state they sought in combat as mushin, no mind, a condition of complete responsive presence without the delay of conscious thought, a state that could also be described in meditation terms as the condition of zazen. The two practices reinforced each other across centuries of samurai culture. The Buddhist temple, the family temple, where the ancestral graves were maintained and memorial services held, was a significant presence in every samurai community. The relationship between a samurai family and their family temple was a long and formal one, maintained across generations. Memorial tablets for the dead, sotoba, wooden markers inscribed with the posthumous Buddhist names of the deceased, stood in the temple cemetery, and the living family made regular visits to maintain them and offer incense and flowers. The dead were understood as present, as witnesses to the conduct of the living, as ancestors who could be honored or dishonored by the behavior of their descendants. This relationship to the ancestral dead was not merely ceremonial, it was a real, felt presence that shaped daily life, a sense of being watched and evaluated by those who had come before. Pilgrimages to important shrines were part of the spiritual calendar. The great Shinto shrines, Iseis, where the sun goddess Amaterasu was enshrined, and the mountain shrines and coastal shrines that dotted the Japanese landscape were destinations for pilgrimages that could take days or weeks of walking. These pilgrimages were physically demanding by design. The effort of the journey was itself a spiritual practice, a way of demonstrating sincerity through physical dedication. A samurai who walked 3 weeks to reach a distant shrine and spent the night in prayer before the journey home was expressing something that a simple donation at a local shrine could not express: the willingness to make the body an instrument of devotion. The castle town, the Jokamachi, was the social world in which most Edo period samurai spent their lives, and understanding it helps us understand both the texture of daily life and the particular social pressures that shaped samurai existence. The castle itself dominated the town physically and symbolically, its white walls visible from miles away, its multiple defensive rings of walls and moats and gates creating a series of concentric zones of access and security. At the center was the keep, the tenshu, often 6 or 7 stories of white plastered walls above massive stone foundations, housing the lord's apartments and providing the ultimate refuge in case of siege. Around it, the inner compound contained the residences of the highest ranking retainers. Beyond that, the middle ranks, and beyond that, the outer areas where lower ranking samurai lived in neighborhoods divided according to rank and function. The samurai quarters were separated from the commercial town below by clear boundaries. Merchants and craftspeople and farmers who supplied the castle town lived in their own districts, the machiya, the townhouses with their shops opening directly onto the street. The distinction between the samurai districts and the commercial districts was not merely physical but constitutional. Samurai were legally a different kind of person, subject to different laws, with different rights and different obligations. A merchant who struck a samurai could be killed on the spot. A samurai who behaved dishonorably toward a merchant would face social consequences from his peers, but not legal ones from the merchant's community. This relationship, complex and often uncomfortable, shaped the social texture of the castle town in ways that were felt daily. Samurai needed merchants. They needed rice sellers and sake brewers and cloth merchants and sword polishers and armor repairers and all the ordinary commercial infrastructure that sustained life. Many samurai were, despite their legal privileges, in significant financial difficulty, their stipends having failed to keep pace with rising costs, their households maintaining the appearances of their status through a kind of permanent quiet economic strain. The merchants, by contrast, were often prosperous, their wealth accumulated through trade in ways that the fixed stipend samurai economy did not permit. There was, through the Edo period, a gradual and culturally significant shifting of the relationship between these two classes. Merchants grew wealthier. Some became the de facto financial backers of their local samurai, lending against stipends that had not yet arrived. The culture of the merchant class, the Chonin culture, with its love of popular entertainment, kabuki theater, the woodblock prints of the ukiyo-e tradition, depicting the floating world of the pleasure districts, the popular fiction and humor that dealt with the absurdities and pleasures of urban life, was vibrant and energetic in ways that the formal culture of the samurai could not always match. The samurai who sneered at merchant culture while secretly enjoying it was a recognizable type in the satirical literature of the period. The daily encounters of castle-town life were governed by a precise etiquette of greeting and acknowledgement. Passing a superior on the street required a specific bow. Receiving a visit from a higher ranking samurai required a specific sequence of greeting and seating and refreshment. Failing to observe these protocols correctly was a social embarrassment. Failing egregiously could be, in extreme cases, a source of genuine trouble. The elaborate courtesy of Japanese public life in the feudal period was not mere decoration. It was the social technology by which a highly armed and highly status conscious warrior class managed to live in close proximity without constant violence. The bow, the correct form of address, the appropriate gift, the precisely calibrated formality of every interaction. These were the mechanisms by which honor could be acknowledged and conflicts diffused before they escalated to the point where swords were involved. Markets and festivals structured the rhythm of the castle town year. The great festivals of the Japanese religious calendar, the summer Obon festival, when the spirits of the ancestors returned for 3 days, the spring festivals associated with shrine deities, the autumn harvest festivals, all of these brought the town together in ways that cut across class lines. Festival days were days when the normal formality loosened somewhat, when the sounds of taiko drums and festival music filled the streets and people moved through the town in their best kimono, and the food stalls set out their offerings, and children ran between adults' legs, pursuing the particular ecstasy that festival days produce in children. No account of samurai life is complete without an honest discussion of seppuku, the ritual suicide that stands at the center of so much Western fascination with the samurai and that deserves to be understood in its actual cultural context rather than through the distorting lens of romanticization or horror. Seppuku, the act of cutting the abdomen with a short blade, was understood within samurai culture as the ultimate assertion of personal honor and agency. The abdomen was considered, in the Japanese spiritual tradition, the location of the hara, the seat of the soul, the center of spiritual and vital power. To cut the abdomen open was to expose and release the center, to die from the inside out in a way that was understood to be completely sincere and completely voluntary. You could not accidentally commit seppuku, could not be forced to go through with it under duress and still have it count as an honorable death. The act required genuine intention and genuine courage, and it was these qualities that the culture honored. In practice, full seppuku was completed by a second, a kaishakunin, a close associate or the most skilled swordsman available, who stood ready to decapitate the dying person the moment the abdominal cut was made, both to end the suffering quickly and to ensure that the death did not become undignified. The kaishakunin role was a position of trust and skill, requiring complete steadiness of nerve and the ability to perform a precise sword stroke at a moment of intense emotional pressure. Seppuku was prescribed in certain circumstances: military defeat, capture by the enemy, failure to prevent harm to one's lord, the receipt of an order from the lord to die, and certain serious violations of the code of honor. It was also available as a form of protest or as a way of dying on one's own terms, rather than accepting an execution that might be less dignified. The famous case of the 47 Ronin, samurai retainers who avenged their lord's forced suicide and then committed seppuku themselves, became one of the most celebrated stories in Japanese cultural history precisely because it illustrated the tension between loyalty and law, between the demands of honor and the demands of the political authority that ran through the samurai tradition. It would be dishonest, however, to give the impression that seppuku was a routine event, or that samurai lived in constant anticipation of being required to perform it. For most samurai, in the long relative peace of the Edo period, the circumstances that would require seppuku never arose. The ritual was always present as a possibility, always part of the horizon of what samurai life could require. But for most people, it remained in that horizon rather than arriving as an actual demand. What it did was provide a kind of existential framework, knowing that the worst case was not capture or humiliation, but a death of one's own choosing, conducted with complete dignity, was genuinely comforting within the values of the tradition. The Ronin, the masterless samurai, occupied a particular and poignant place in the culture and imagination of feudal Japan. The word Ronin means literally wave man, a person tossed on the waves, without anchor, without direction, a samurai who has lost his lord through the lord's death, through disgrace, or through some breakdown in the relationship that could not be repaired. The Ronin's situation was in many ways the defining tragedy of the samurai system. He was still a samurai in terms of training and capability. He still wore his swords, still possessed the skills of the warrior, still carried the cultural formation of a lifetime in the samurai tradition. But he had lost the thing that gave that formation its meaning. Service was the definition of the samurai, and a samurai without a lord was, in the most fundamental sense, unmoored. The options for a Ronin were limited. He could seek service with another lord, which was possible but required a reputation and connections that not all Ronin had. He could open a dojo and teach swordsmanship, which was a respectable option for a skilled warrior. He could turn to scholarship or medicine or one of the other paths that required education rather than service. Or he could drift, surviving by his sword, in ways that ranged from honorable to criminal, taking on bodyguard work or settling disputes for merchants who needed someone capable of violence on their behalf. The figure of the Ronin in Japanese popular culture, the lone masterless warrior wandering through a corrupt world, dispensing rough justice and then moving on, is one of the most enduring archetypes in all of East Asian literature and film. The chambara, the sword fighting film genre, of which Akira Kurosawa's work is the most famous Western example, returns again and again to this figure because he contains a genuine cultural tension, a man formed for loyalty who must now operate without it, a man trained for violence who must decide moment to moment when violence is just and when it is merely expedient. The Ronin is the samurai stripped of his social context, his virtues and his skills exposed in their purest form, because there is no institution left to shelter and direct them. The historical Ronin population of Edo period Japan was substantial and was considered a genuine social problem by the shogunate, which periodically tried to manage it through various measures. A large population of trained, armed, unattached warriors in a society that was otherwise deeply ordered and controlled created obvious tensions. The responses ranged from encouraging Ronin to seek new positions to outright suppression, and the history of the period contains many cases of Ronin who became genuine threats to public order, alongside cases of Ronin who found new purpose and meaning in the spaces their masterless status created. Let us return toward the end of our day to the more ordinary pleasures of the samurai world. The evening meal was the most substantial of the day, and in a prosperous samurai household, it was also a social occasion. The Japanese culinary tradition of the Edo period was already highly developed. The cuisine of Kyoto, the imperial capital, with its emphasis on seasonal vegetables and delicate preparations, the cuisine of Osaka, the commercial city, with its focus on seafood and bold flavors, and the cuisine of Edo, the shogunal capital, with its growing taste for fresh sushi and tempura and buckwheat noodles, all existed and influenced one another. A samurai household's evening meal would begin invariably with the rice, steamed white rice, the foundation of the meal, served in a covered lacquer bowl to keep it warm. Alongside it would come a soup, usually miso soup, but sometimes a clear broth with seasonal ingredients, and then a series of small dishes, okazu, chosen to complement the rice. Seasonal fish, either fresh if near the coast, or dried and preserved if inland, prepared by grilling or simmering in a sauce of soy and sake and mirin. Vegetables, seasonal and carefully prepared, eggplant in autumn, bamboo shoots in spring, mushrooms in late summer, winter radish pickled or simmered. Tofu in various preparations, pickled vegetables, always, their sharp contrast cutting through the richness of the other dishes and stimulating the appetite for the next bite of rice. The aesthetics of the meal extended to the vessels, lacquered bowls, ceramic dishes chosen for their relationship to the season and the food they contained, the placement of dishes on a low tray in a composition that was intended to please the eye as well as the palate. Even a simple meal in a samurai household aspired to a quality of presentation that reflected the same care and attention brought to the tea ceremony or the garden. The food was not merely sustenance, it was an expression of the values of the household. Sake, rice wine, was the central social lubricant of samurai culture. Warm sake served in small ceramic cups, the exchange of cups between people as a mark of fellowship, the gradual loosening of the formal constraints of the day as the evening progressed. This was the texture of samurai social life after dark. Drinking was not considered unsamurai like. The ability to drink well, meaning with enjoyment and good fellowship, but without losing one's composure or one's dignity, was itself a social accomplishment. Getting visibly drunk and behaving badly was, on the other hand, a source of real shame. The evenings in a samurai household with guests might include music, conversation, perhaps a game of Go, the strategic board game that was a serious intellectual pursuit in its own right and was played at high levels by both samurai and lords. Go, with its elegant simplicity of rules and its bottomless strategic complexity, was the intellectual equivalent of the kata, a discipline that could be studied for a lifetime without exhaustion, and that revealed, in the quality of a player's decisions, something real about their character and thinking. Stories would be told, jokes in the specific register of samurai humor, and the evening would pass in a warmth of fellowship that existed alongside and within the formality of the hierarchy. When the guests had gone and the household settled for the night, the samurai would perform the final rituals of the day: the bath, the reading or writing of a few lines in a journal, perhaps, the brief prayers at the family altar, the rolling out of the futon on the tatami. The screens would be closed against the night air. The sounds of the castle town, the distant call of a watchman making his rounds, the bark of a dog, the wind in the garden would settle around the house. Sleep, for someone who had trained hard and worked and eaten and drunk with friends and attended to all the duties of the day, came easily and deeply. The samurai sleeping on his futon in his modest room in the castle town, his swords arranged within reach, the night quiet around him, was in that moment neither a figure of romance nor of horror, but simply a human being at rest after a full day, the same as people everywhere and in every time, the same as you lie wherever you are lying tonight, the day settling, the breath slowing, the world going quieter by degrees. The samurai world did not end suddenly. It dissolved gradually and then rapidly over the course of the 19th century as Japan's forced opening to the Western powers after 1853 exposed the gap between the feudal military system and the industrial technologies of Europe and America. The shogunate that had governed Japan for 2.5 centuries collapsed in 1868 in the upheaval known as the Meiji Restoration, which nominally returned political power to the emperor, but was in practice a revolution carried out by ambitious samurai from several powerful domains who recognized that Japan needed to modernize at speed to avoid the fate of China already being carved up by Western colonial powers. These reformers dismantled the feudal system that had sustained the samurai class, abolished the formal class distinctions, permitted merchants to bear surnames, and former farmers to move freely between occupations, and most devastatingly for the samurai identity, banned the wearing of swords in public. The sword ban of 1876 was not merely a practical measure of disarmament. It was the removal of the most fundamental marker of samurai identity. A samurai without his swords was not merely disarmed, he was, in the most visible and daily sense, deprived of the sign that told the world and himself what he was. The former samurai of the Meiji period were given government bonds in compensation for their lost stipends, bonds that many of them invested poorly or lost to the economic disruptions of rapid industrialization. They became school teachers, policemen, government officials, businessmen, soldiers in the new Western style military. Some became impoverished. Some thrived in the new order. Some never fully recovered from the loss. The last armed resistance to the new order, the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by the charismatic former samurai Saigo Takamori, ended in his defeat and death. He has been celebrated ever since, not without irony, as the last samurai, a figure of noble anachronism fighting against the tide of history, and there is something true in that image, however complicated the politics that surrounded him were. What the Meiji period did not eliminate was the cultural legacy of the samurai tradition. The values that the samurai had articulated and practiced, The emphasis on discipline and honor and self cultivation, the insistence on the martial and literary arts together, the acceptance of death, and the fullness of life that acceptance permitted were consciously appropriated by the modernizing Japanese state and repackaged as the basis of a new national identity. The soldier of the Meiji and subsequent eras was presented as the inheritor of the samurai tradition, his discipline, and his willingness to die framed in the same terms that Bushido had always used. This appropriation had consequences that extended well into the 20th century and that belonged to a different and more complicated history. But that is not our story tonight. Tonight, our story is the daily life, the waking and training and eating and praying and dying of the men and women who inhabited the feudal world in its fullness before the ships arrived and the world changed and the swords were put away. Let us be honest with each other, as we always are in these stories. If you had been born into samurai culture, the demands it would have placed on you would have been, by the standards of the comfortable modern world, very nearly impossible to meet. The physical demands alone would begin to separate you from the experience quickly. The morning training session would, in the first week, leave muscles screaming that you did not know you had. The seiza position, sitting in formal kneeling posture for extended periods, would have your knees and ankles sending increasingly urgent signals within the first 20 minutes. The kata practice, repeating the same sword movement 200 times in a single session with full attention and full physical commitment each time, would demand a kind of focused repetition that the modern world, with its constant stream of novelty and stimulation, does not prepare people for. The dietary adjustment would be significant. The rice centered diet, nutritious and appropriate to the climate and the available agriculture, was also plain in a way that a palate formed on sugar and salt and fat, and the enormous variety of modern food would find difficult. The miso soup with its fermented depth, the pickled vegetables with their sharpness, the plain steamed rice without sauce or butter, these are all good, and in many cases deeply delicious, but they are not what a 21st century body has been trained to want. The absence of sweetness, in particular, would be felt. The social constraints would be the hardest. The constant awareness of one's position in the hierarchy, the need to calibrate every interaction with precision, to bow at exactly the right depth, and to use exactly the right form of address, to never put a foot wrong in public in ways that would reflect on the clan and the lord, to maintain composure under conditions of physical discomfort and social pressure simultaneously. This is an extraordinary demand. It is a demand that people who grew up inside the system managed because they had never known anything else, because the calibration had been installed from birth and was as natural to them as breathing. But to arrive in that world from outside, with the informal habits and the unguarded expressiveness of a modern person, would be to find oneself in constant, exhausting breach of protocols that other people around you were navigating without apparent effort. And then there is the relationship to death, the genuine acceptance, not the performance of acceptance, but the real thing of one's own mortality as a daily companion, integrated into the fabric of life rather than pushed away to the periphery. This is the demand that most of us, living in a culture that avoids death obsessively, would find most foreign and most difficult. To sit down each morning and genuinely contemplate your own death, to feel that contemplation not as morbid or anxious, but as clarifying and freeing, to carry that acceptance into the training yard and into the tea ceremony and into the evening meal without it dimming the pleasure of any of them. This is the spiritual achievement at the center of the samurai world, and it is not one that most of us have been prepared for. Yet there is something in it that calls to people across centuries and cultures, and the reason it calls is not the violence or the romance of the sword. It is the coherence. The samurai world, for all its cruelties and rigidities and injustices, was a world in which every element of life was meant to cohere with every other. The physical training with the aesthetic cultivation, the warrior discipline with the meditative attention, the service to the Lord with the service to the ancestors, the full presence in the moment with the acceptance of its passing. The tea ceremony and the sword were not opposites, but expressions of the same underlying practice. Be completely here, in this moment, with this thing, without calculation or distraction. That is perhaps the gift that the samurai tradition, in its best moments, was trying to give to the people who lived inside it. Let us end where the day ends, in the garden. It is autumn. The leaves of the maple tree in the corner of the garden have turned to a deep red that holds the last light of the evening as if reluctant to let it go. The stones in the garden have darkened slightly with the dew that has begun to form. The sound of water from the bamboo pipe into the stone basin is steady and unhurried. From somewhere in the castle town below, the sound of taiko drums from a distant festival. The samurai sits on the ngawa, the wooden veranda that runs along the outside of the house, facing the garden. He has changed out of his training clothes. He has eaten. He has bathed. He is holding a cup of sake that has gone from warm to cool in the time he has been sitting here, looking at the garden, thinking nothing in particular. His sword lies beside him, the katana in its lacquered scabbard, the familiar weight and presence of it. He is 43 years old. He has been training with swords since he was 6. He has never had to use them in actual combat, which is a fact he considers sometimes with a feeling he cannot entirely categorize. Gratitude, perhaps, or something more complicated, the particular feeling of having been prepared for something that never came. His son is inside, practicing his calligraphy by lamplight. The strokes of the brush on the paper make a small sound, barely audible. His wife is speaking quietly to a servant in the kitchen. The last light is leaving the sky to the west, the color going from gold to amber to the deep, specific blue that comes just before full darkness in Japan in autumn. A blue with a gray in it and a cold in it, and a quality of stillness that the Japanese have a word for, tasogare, the time of growing darkness, when you can no longer quite make out a person's face, when the world exists at the threshold between visibility and its absence. He finishes the sake. He watches the light go. He is completely here, in this garden, in this evening, in this life he was born to, and has lived inside without much question. The maple tree holds its red a little longer. The basin fills and overflows in its slow rhythm. The drums in the distance stop, and then start again, and then stop for the last time. In a little while he will go inside. He will speak with his son about the calligraphy, will correct a particular stroke with a demonstration that takes 3 seconds of fluid movement and that the boy will practice for the next hour trying to replicate. He will say goodnight to his wife. He will read a few lines from a collection of waka poems he has been working through for the past month. He will unroll the futon and lie down on the tatami, and the house will settle around him into its nighttime sounds. And he will close his eyes, and his breathing will slow, and the samurai and the garden and the autumn and the particular blue of that last light will all dissolve together into the quiet that comes after a day fully lived. The samurai world was profoundly organized around the natural calendar in a way that modern industrial life has largely severed. The four seasons were not merely weather variations, but were experienced as distinct moral and aesthetic climates, each with its own demands and its own gifts, each requiring a different quality of attention and a different set of activities. Spring, Haru, was the season of renewal and of the most iconic image in all of Japanese aesthetics, the cherry blossom, Sakura. The cherry blossom occupies its central place in Japanese culture, not despite its brevity, but because of it. The blossoms last, at their peak, barely a week before wind and rain send them falling in pale pink drifts through the air and onto the ground and the surface of ponds. This fleeting beauty was understood as the perfect natural emblem of the central Buddhist and Shinto teaching about impermanence, that things are beautiful precisely because they do not last, that the cherry blossom in full bloom contains within it the awareness of its own falling, and that the most honest and most alive response to this is not grief, but a kind of heightened, tender attention. Cherry blossom viewing, hanami, was a practice that the samurai class embraced as fully as any other. Picnics under the blossoms, sake cups passed around, poems composed in praise of the flowers and in acknowledgement of their going. Spring was also the beginning of the agricultural year for the domains the samurai administered, and the logistics of planting and water management and the coordination of peasant labor were real administrative responsibilities that fell to the samurai who managed a lord's estates. The samurai was, among other things, a local government official, and the beginning of the farming season required attention and organization. The stipend that supported the samurai household came ultimately from the rice that the peasants grew and paid as tax, and the connection between the samurai's comfortable life and the labor of the people below him in the social structure was not abstract, but immediate and daily, visible in the figures on the rice account books and in the faces of the farmers who appeared at the estate office with their petitions and complaints. Summer Natsu was the season of heat and rain and the great summer festivals. The Japanese summer is not mild. In the lowlands and the inland valleys, the combination of heat and humidity that builds through July and August is genuinely oppressive, and the samurai household managed it through architectural strategies. The screens opened to catch any breeze, the garden's water feature providing a degree of cool sound, if not actual cool, the lightest summer kimono worn, made of ramy or fine cotton rather than the heavy silk or wool of colder months. Summer was also the season of insects, the cicadas that began their ringing chorus in late July and built to a crescendo through August before suddenly stopping in the first cool nights of September were so characteristic of the Japanese summer soundscape that their sound in classical literature could stand for summer itself. The Oban festival in midsummer, the 3 days when the spirits of the ancestors were believed to return to visit the living, was one of the most emotionally significant events of the samurai year. Lanterns were lit to guide the returning spirits home. Ritual dances, the bon odori, were performed in the town squares. Offerings of food and incense were placed at the family altar and at the graves in the temple cemetery. The atmosphere of Obon was not frightening but festive, shot through with a particular tenderness. The sense of the dead as genuinely present, genuinely interested in the welfare of their living descendants, genuinely comforted by the attention and love offered to them across the boundary of death. For a samurai who lived with a more continuous awareness of mortality than most, the Oban festival was not an interruption of ordinary life, but an intensification of something already present in it. Autumn, Aki-e, was considered by many Japanese aesthetes the most beautiful season, the season of the full moon, the maple leaves, the cooling air, and the harvest. The Mid-Autumn Moon Festival, Tsukimi, was an occasion for outdoor gatherings where sake and rice dumplings, tsukimi dango, were offered to the moon and poems were composed in its praise. The harvest moon, enormous and amber colored on the horizon, rising through the haze of late September, was considered the most beautiful moon of the year and was one of the canonical subjects of Japanese poetry. Autumn was also the season when the domain's rice harvest was brought in, when the accounts were settled and the stipends calculated, and the general assessment of the year's agricultural productivity was made. The anxiety of the harvest, the hope for good weather, and the fear of typhoon or drought was shared between the samurai class and the peasantry who depended on it, though for different reasons. A poor harvest meant reduced stipends for the samurai and potential starvation for the farmers, and the relationship between the administrative class and the agricultural class was never more charged than in the weeks of the autumn harvest, when the balance of the year was weighed and found sufficient or insufficient. Winter, Fuyu, was the season of austerity and endurance. The cold in the castle towns of northern Japan and in the mountain domains was genuinely serious. Temperatures well below freezing, snowfall that could cut off communities for days, the drafty wooden buildings of the period providing significantly less insulation than their Western equivalents. The samurai household in winter was organized around the warmth of the irori hearth. The communal fire set into the floor of the main room, where the family gathered in the evenings, with their feet under the quilted covers of the kotatsu, the low table with a heat source underneath, sharing warmth and the longer evenings. Training continued in winter, because training always continued, and the specific discipline of enduring cold was considered part of the hardening. Stepping barefoot onto the frozen courtyard, conducting the morning ritual ablutions with cold water that was now close to ice, sitting in zazen in an unheated room as the breath clouded in the air before the face. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, was marked with ritual and reflection. It was the turning point of the year, the moment when the darkness had reached its maximum and the light began imperceptibly to return. Many samurai used the solstice as an occasion for review and intention, looking back at the year's conduct, acknowledging failures and successes, setting the direction of attention for the year to come. This practice of periodic review, of honest self-examination in private, was one of the discipline-based virtues of the tradition, part of the ongoing project of becoming a person whose actions matched the ideals to which they aspired. It would be a significant omission to leave the women of the samurai class without proper attention, because the women of samurai families occupied a role that was more complex and more martial than standard Western accounts of Japanese history have often allowed. The concept of the onabugisha, the female martial artist of the warrior class, is not a modern invention or a romantic fantasy. It was a real tradition with documented practitioners across several centuries whose existence tells us something important about how the samurai world actually worked. Samurai women were trained in the naginata, the long curved pole weapon, from childhood, and this training was not ceremonial. It was functional, intended to prepare women to defend the home and family when the men of the household were away at war or on service. The naginata is, in many ways, an ideal weapon for a woman defending an interior space. Its long reach allows a smaller defender to keep a larger attacker at a distance. Its sweeping cuts are effective against unarmored legs and ankles. It requires less brute upper body strength than a sword and more technique, which rewards training over raw power. The specific tactical situation of a samurai home under attack, with the female members of the household holding the interior while help was sought, is one for which the naginata was precisely suited, and the women who trained with it were not hobbyists, but serious martial artists. Documented historical cases of samurai women fighting in actual combat exist across the medieval and Edo periods. Tomoe Gozen, who fought in the Genpei War of the late 12th century, is perhaps the most famous, a warrior of extraordinary skill whose exploits are recorded in the Tale of the Heike, one of the great works of Japanese military literature. Hangaku Gozen defended a mountain fortress in the 13th century with a garrison of 3,000 soldiers. Nakano Takeko fought with a naginata at the Battle of Aizu in 1868, one of the last battles of the samurai era. These women were not exceptions to the tradition. They were its most visible expressions. Beyond martial skill, samurai women were expected to maintain the household with a competence that was genuinely demanding. The management of a samurai compound, with its staff of servants and its complex social obligations and its careful financial management of the stipend, required education, organizational skill, and the ability to make consequential decisions quickly. A samurai wife whose husband was away for extended periods on domain business or military service might be the effective head of the household for months at a time, responsible for the education of the children, the maintenance of social relationships with neighboring samurai families, and the management of the estate's finances. This was not a role for the decorative or the passive. The education of samurai women included classical literature, poetry, calligraphy, and the social arts of music and tea ceremony, alongside the martial training. A woman who could compose a waka poem in the classical tradition, manage a tea ceremony with appropriate grace, and defend her household with a naginata was, within the values of the culture, an ideal, the female parallel to the Bunbu Ryodo ideal of the male samurai who cultivated both literary and martial excellence. This does not mean that samurai women were free or equal by modern standards. They were not. Their lives were structured by the same hierarchies that structured everything in feudal Japan: loyalty to lord, obedience to father, and then to husband, the subordination of personal desire to family and institutional obligation. The samurai wife who disagreed with her husband's decisions had very limited formal recourse. The range of choices available to a samurai woman was significantly narrower than that available to a samurai man, and the consequences of stepping outside those choices were real and serious. And yet, within those constraints, the inner life of samurai women, as expressed in the diaries and letters and poems that survive from the period, reveals people of considerable interior richness and complexity. Women who mourned husbands, killed in battle with a grief at once formal in its expression and clearly genuine in its depth. Women who took genuine pleasure in the cultivation of their gardens and the education of their children. Women who composed poetry of real quality and shared it within networks of literary friendship that crossed class lines. Women who managed, within the narrow margin available to them, to be fully themselves. The world that we have been describing tonight was not static. It changed continuously over the centuries, and the samurai who lived through the final decades of the feudal system experienced a disorientation that is worth contemplating. By the middle of the 19th century, the long Edo peace had produced a samurai class that was in many cases more comfortable than it was martial. Generations of peace meant that many samurai had never drawn their swords in combat, and realistically never would. The stipend system had calcified, ranks were hereditary, stipends were fixed, and the connection between actual military capability and social position had grown tenuous in many domains. A samurai of modest stipend who trained diligently and maintained genuine martial skill might be outranked and outstipended by a hereditary retainer who had grown soft and scholarly. The tension between the ideal and the reality was a live subject in samurai culture throughout the Edo period, generating a substantial literature of complaint about the decline of martial values and the seduction of luxury. When the American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 with his steam-powered warships and demanded that Japan open its ports to Western trade, the shock was both practical and existential. The practical shock was obvious. Here were weapons and military technology that made every aspect of samurai training and equipment look archaic. The existential shock was deeper. The entire social order of feudal Japan, the hierarchy of samurai over merchants and farmers, the shogunate's claim to represent the proper order of things, was suddenly revealed as contingent, as one possible way of organizing a society, rather than the eternal and natural order it had always presented itself as being. The 15 years between Perry's arrival and the Meiji Restoration were a time of extraordinary turbulence, during which the samurai class was both the agent of change and its primary casualty. The men who dismantled the shogunate were samurai. The men who created the new national army were samurai. The men who wrote the Meiji Constitution and reorganized the economy and sent the first Japanese students to study in America and Europe were almost entirely samurai or the sons of samurai. They knew that the world they were building would make their own class obsolete, and they built it anyway because they saw no other way. The last generation of samurai who grew up under the feudal system and then lived through its dissolution experienced a loss that has no precise modern equivalent. They had been formed by a world shaped from childhood by its disciplines and its codes and its aesthetics, and then they watched that world being dismantled around them in the space of a single decade. The swords that had been the sign of their identity were banned. The stipends that had supported their households were converted to bonds, and then in many cases, effectively eliminated by economic disruption. The hierarchies that had structured every social interaction, every bow, and every form of address, and every seating arrangement were legally abolished. Some of them adapted with remarkable flexibility and found new purposes in the new Japan. Some became the bureaucrats and educators and business leaders and military officers of the Meiji era, carrying the values of their training into new contexts and new forms. Some could not adapt, and the late 19th century Japanese literature contains their stories too. The old samurai of the Meiji period, living in genteel poverty, in a neighborhood that used to be the samurai quarter, polishing swords that no one would ever again wear in public, practicing kata in the early morning in a garden that needed tending. The sword was put away. The top knot was cut. The castle towns were incorporated into the modern prefectural system, and the castles themselves became government offices or military installations, or eventually tourist sites. The tea ceremony survived. The martial arts survived, transformed into sports and disciplines practiced for their own sake rather than as preparation for actual combat. The poetry and the calligraphy survived, something of the aesthetic sensibility of the samurai world, its attention to seasonal beauty and to the quality of presence in daily life, survived in the culture of modern Japan in ways that are still visible to any attentive visitor. The samurai are gone. The world that made them is gone. But the questions they tried to answer about how to live with discipline and beauty and awareness of mortality and genuine care for the people in one's charge are not gone, because those are not questions that any particular century has a monopoly on. They are the old questions, the permanent questions, the ones that arrive in the quiet of a late evening when the day has settled and the breath is slowing and the mind for a moment is clear enough to ask them. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. We have talked around the sword all evening without giving it the direct attention it deserves. Let us remedy that now, in these last quiet minutes, because the katana is not merely a weapon in the samurai tradition. It is an object of spiritual significance, an expression of craft at the highest level, and a physical presence in the samurai's life that was daily and intimate in a way that few objects in modern life are. The Japanese sword was made by a process of extraordinary technical sophistication that took generations to develop and that no industrial process has fully replicated. The swordsmith, the katanakaji, began with raw iron sand, tamahagon, smelted in a clay furnace called a tatara. Over the course of several days, the fire tended continuously, the iron building up in layers of varying carbon content. The resulting steel was then folded and worked, beaten out and folded again. The process repeated many times over, aligning the crystalline structure of the steel in a way that gave the finished blade its characteristic combination of qualities. A hard, sharp edge capable of holding a cutting edge through repeated use, and a softer, more flexible spine that prevented the blade from shattering on impact. The forging was not merely technical, but ritual. The swordsmith worked in a purified space, wearing the white robes of a Shinto priest, having observed periods of fasting and prayer before and during the most critical stages of the work. The fire was sacred, the iron was sacred, the act of transformation was sacred. A sword made without this ritual attention was considered within the tradition inferior, not just spiritually, but practically. The quality of the smith's mind and intention was understood to be present in the finished blade in a way that was not metaphorical but real. The polisher, the togashi, spent weeks working the finished blade through progressively finer grades of waterstone, revealing the hamen, the distinctive wavy line along the edge where the hard and soft sections of the steel met, a line as unique to each blade as a fingerprint, expressing in its pattern the specific choices the smith had made in the differential tempering process. The lacquered wooden scabbard, the saya, was made to fit the blade precisely, the fit so exact that the blade slid home with a specific soft click and was held snugly by the friction of the lacquer against the blade without any mechanical lock. The fittings, the suba guard, and the various metal collars and fittings that secured the blade in the handle were objects of craft in their own right, often elaborately decorated with landscapes or animals or abstract patterns by specialist metalworkers who devoted their entire careers to these small, perfect objects. When a samurai received a new sword or inherited an ancestral blade, the sword was introduced to the household's ancestors at the family altar with a formal ceremony. Swords were named. They were considered to have characters, histories, presences. An old sword with a famous history carried the weight of every hand that had held it and every event in which it had been present. Some blades were hundreds of years old and had passed through many hands, their surfaces worn by generations of use and care, their histories recorded in documents that accompanied them through the centuries. The daily care of the sword was a routine of considerable intimacy, wiping the blade with a soft cloth to remove any moisture or fingerprints, applying a light coat of clove oil to prevent rust, checking the tightness of the handle fittings, cleaning the interior of the scabbard. This was not maintenance, but relationship, the daily attention one gives to something precious and alive in its own way, something that requires care to remain what it is. A samurai who neglected his sword was neglecting something central to his identity and his responsibility. When the Maji government banned the wearing of swords in 1876, the sword did not disappear. It went inside, into the home, into the private space where many of the old things went when they were no longer permitted in public. Samurai families kept their swords. They were cleaned and maintained and displayed in the tokonoma where the scroll had hung. They were brought out on formal occasions. They were passed from father to son and from mother to daughter through generations that had no memory of anyone actually wearing them. Some of those swords are still in family collections today, in Japan and around the world. They are old, some of them extraordinarily old, centuries old, their surfaces darkened and their histories long. They were made by men who prayed over the fire as they worked and who believed that the quality of their attention was present in the steel. Whether or not one shares that belief, the objects themselves are evidence of an extraordinary sustained human effort to make something perfect, to take raw iron from the earth and transform it through fire and fold and stone and prayer into a blade that would hold an edge and balance in the hand and last for centuries and mean something to the person who carried it, that went far beyond its function as a cutting instrument. The sword as object, the sword as symbol, the sword as daily companion and ancestral inheritance and spiritual practice and aesthetic achievement. This is what we are talking about when we talk about the samurai and their blades. Not the violence, though violence was always present as possibility and sometimes as fact. The object itself, held in the hands, its weight and its balance, and the particular quality of light on its polished surface in the evening. The sword carried quietly in the sash, its weight familiar and constant, the samurai moving through his day with it always at his side. This is the image to hold as the story ends, not drawn, not threatened, not used, simply present, the way anything truly essential is present, noticed without being noticed, part of the body's weight and the body's knowledge, as natural as a breath. The samurai sits in the garden as the last light goes. The maple holds its red against the dark. The water moves in the stone basin. The sword lies in the grass beside him, scabbarded, still, and the night comes in quietly, the way nights always have, the way nights will long after all the stories about this one have been told and forgotten and told again. Rest now, and now, perhaps, so might you. You have traveled a long way tonight, across an ocean and across centuries, through training yards and gardens and castle towns and tea rooms. You have walked inside a life very different from yours in almost every practical detail, and perhaps not so different in the things that matter most. The desire to do something well, to serve something worth serving, to be present in your life without flinching from its passing, to find in the ordinary moments of a day the kind of attention that makes them real. The tatami mat and the futon, the cold water on the face in the early morning, the weight of the swords, so familiar as to be almost forgotten, the rice in the lacquer bowl, steam rising in the morning air, the sound of the bakken striking in the training yard, the brush moving across the paper, the tea in the bowl, warm in the hands, the garden in the last light of the day. Let the images fade now, like ink dissolving in water, like smoke from an incense stick drifting up and losing its shape against the ceiling. There is nothing you need to hold on to. There is nothing here that needs to be remembered, just the breath going in and going out, just the weight of your body settling into wherever you are, just the quiet that is always waiting underneath the noise of the day, patient and deep, like water under ice. If sleep has already taken you, that is exactly right. If your thoughts are still drifting through the castle town, finding their way toward the gate, that is also right. The story will carry you wherever you need to go. Thank you for spending this quiet time with drowsy history. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, I hope the words have carried you somewhere gentle. Leave a soft comment when you wake, if you remember. Tell me where you were listening from. Tell me if you made it past the tea ceremony, or the training yard, or the autumn garden. It means more than you know. Until the next quiet evening, sleep well, breathe slowly, and let rest come exactly as it should.